Welcome to the Civic Pulse. Civic means society, and the Civic Pulse looks at what's going on between our families, our neighbors, and our government. Every month, we connect with diverse influencers, changemakers, and leaders. These are conversations at intersections across America. I'm Dr. Dilara Sayeed, and I'm honored to serve as the host of the Civic Pulse podcast. The podcast is produced by Osama Rezi and Subhan Ashrafi and the Civic Pulse team. Let's go. Today, Civic Pulse guest is Dr. Catherine Pozniak. Catherine is an education finance expert. She specializes in state and federal fiscal policy and strategy. She advises state and school districts on finance matters, including state budget development, grants management, strategy, and federal funding flexibilities. Catherine previously served as Assistant State Superintendent at the Louisiana Department of Education, where she managed an annual budget of $5.5 billion. She also oversaw programmatic and fiscal policy implementation of Louisiana's state plans, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, and the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. Catherine and I met as we were both going through our doctoral program in education, leadership, and policy. So, Catherine, the beginning of the school year, and it started for many students.
Yes.
How are you feeling right now? Every time at the beginning of the year, teachers and former teachers, and you were a former teacher, have strong feelings. How are you doing?
Yes. So I actually I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I actually am located in Georgia, so I'm in the South where they've actually been in school for several weeks now. And so it's interesting now that I'm on sort of the administrative side of things and thinking about finances and funding. I'm on a little bit of a different timeline than it is with schools. It's planning for the beginning of the school year usually starts for many school districts
Mhm.
in late winter, early spring. So it's great to see that finally come to fruition. We also had an interesting summer when it comes to federal funding. So it'll where there was some delays in federal funding that school districts received. So it was definitely an eventful summer, but for now, things seem to be on track and folks are getting ready to go.
We'll talk about all of this, and we see this almost as a series of issues as the school year progresses because so many potential changes are coming through from the Department of Education. You've been in the education system in America for many years. So, what's the role of the US Department of Education? Most families know they take their kids to their public school, or they take their kids to the private school, or they homeschool. But what role does the federal government, the US Department of Education, have in our schooling?
Yes. So, what's interesting about our school system in the US is that it is very decentralized. It is mostly run at the local and state level. Funding for education is predominantly funded through local taxes. So that's why you see really wide variety of schools, and because it is so dependent on the local tax revenue that they could raise. The second major source of funding revenue for schools would be state funding.
Mhm.
Usually, education funding for K-12 education is usually, in most cases, the largest single line item in the state budget there. And so local school districts are really making decisions about what's the curriculum that they're choosing, what are the different educational programs. States are setting parameters around standards, right? What should every sixth grader be learning in math this year, right? That's really up to the states in terms of policy. So the federal role is actually quite limited. The U.S. Department of Education is actually one of the newer federal agencies there. It was established in the early, like 1980. Um,
Mhm.
and and I should mention, so we call it the U.S. Department of Education. Many people might call it the DOE for short. Many states call their Department of Education the DOE. The DOE was already taken at the federal level. That's the Department of Energy. So you're going to probably hear me talk about ED today. I want to be clear, I'm not talking about ED, the person, but that's the acronym that we use for the U.S. Department of Education, USED, and we use ED for short. So at the federal level, there's several roles that the U.S. Department of Education plays, at least with K-12 education. They do provide on average, about 10% of
Mhm.
education funding nationally. That percentage is going to be far higher in areas with higher poverty, right? So most of the money that the U.S. Department of Education administers is targeted toward vulnerable student populations, low income kids, English learners, students with disabilities, right? So they sort of have very targeted funding streams. The other thing that the US Department of Education does that is very important is it collects and disseminates a lot of data. So while every state gets to decide what their students in that state are learning, they do have to report to the US Department of Education. They do need to have some sort of accountability system, right? That again is customized at every state, but they do have to provide data to the US Department of Education. So that's how we can say, this is what education in Illinois looks like versus this is what
Mhm.
education in Georgia looks like. And that plays a really important role, right? And can be a really galvanizing force when it comes to helping to improve educational quality across the country. And then there's also just a system of supports that the US Department of Education provides. Not unlike we also see the government invest in research, for instance, for healthcare, right, and medicine. We see the same thing in education. It is providing uh, supports both to states and also in research and disseminating best practices. And then the final thing I would say that is a really important role that the Department of Education plays is in the protection of civil rights. It does have a Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education in making sure that students are being served equitably, whether they are students with disabilities, whether they are English learners, and so on.
I really appreciate this historical reference as well as the breakdown of what it does today. About 10 years ago, I'm a Chicago kid. Illinois was 50th out of 50 states in education funding. So right down at the bottom. And that was a big election point
Yes.
in 2016, 2018. Like, how is a state like this, with one of the largest cities in the nation, one of the largest school districts in the nation, many other school districts, and a large population, the worst in school budgeting? And so, as you said, the largest part of a school's budget will come from between your municipal and your state budgets. We are not now, and so but it takes work, right? It takes political will, it takes political courage, and then it takes funding and priorities at the state level. So the state's role is really critical. The federal government's roles, as you spoke about, one of the other things we had talked about in our doctoral program was using the bully pulpit
Yes.
to make some of these things happen at the federal government. So if the federal Department of Ed wanted to instill something in the curriculum, if they wanted to promote sports for women, if they wanted to change a policy, using that bully pulpit to do it. So, what's changing now with the ed and the bully pulpit with the current administration?
Right. So we certainly see this, and I would say this is not unique to the U.S. Department of Education. Right, we're seeing this across federal agencies with
Mm.
the new administration. Would see there are some things that are just going as you had said before, and actually this administration, one of the issues that it has taken up, for instance, is AI in education, right? And the president issued an executive order on this. That said, we're seeing executive orders on a lot of sweeping things here, and how that is trickling down to education policy, specifically earlier this spring or earlier this year. There was an executive order specifically about dismantling the Department of Education. This has been sort of a talking point for many years. There were people originally, when the Department of Education was established, weren't happy about it. And that's always been in the background. This is the first time that that has actually sort of come together or come to
Mhm.
fruition in an executive order. That said, the president doesn't have the power to actually dismantle the Department of Education. That is established by Congress, and is up to Congress to do. But we're certainly seeing some shifts happening in both funding and staffing at the Department of Education, where they've pulled back on some of the supports and services that they are providing. So,
Mhm.
as this administration is pushing out, again, executive orders on a whole host of things, then we're seeing that trickle down to the agency level. In our case, again, the U.S. Department of Education, and seeing them enact that in various ways. An example of that would be, we saw an
Mhm.
executive order about English first, in terms of language primacy in the United States. What we saw a few weeks ago from the Department of Education is that they had guidance on how to support English learners in the classroom. And we saw now that that guidance has been tucked away and archived. And so that would be an example of some of the things that we're seeing sort of flow through. One of the things that we saw this summer is that temporarily the funding for English learners was withheld, right? And we
Mhm.
weren't sure that that was going to be renewed. That is going to be renewed for this year, but that was again proposed by the administration in their budget, not to fund Title III, which is programs for English learners. So we're again sort of seeing these sort of sweeping changes at the federal level, and then seeing agencies enact that in different ways depending on what their purview is.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing also the specific ways that this will impact students and families. We have about just under 60 million students in K-12 schools and classrooms across the country, but the education sector is one of the largest employers of Americans. How is this changing how teachers, special education educators, principals, support staff are able to do their work?
So I think we're still sort of seeing how this all plays out, right? This is very much sort of talked at the highest sort of policy levels at this point.
Mm.
This summer, when that federal funding typically shows up in districts or states on July 1, and on June 30th, they said that, you know what, we're this funding's under review. And it really put into question whether that was, going to flow. And that was really sort of the first time that what has been happening at the federal level sort of was had the potential to impact what was happening with families in classrooms, right? So summer programs that were funded by federal programs, right, were halted, and such. And so on the day to day right now, I think we're seeing that in small ways, right? So grants that pay for teacher training, right, and that support higher education programs to train the next generation of teachers. Some of those grants have been cut. Grants to support mental health in schools, those have been cut and retracted, right? And so some of the programs that people may have seen in their schools may be fading away, right? Some of the resources that are available to train teachers may be, they're going to go on for this year, but they're at risk, right? So I think
Mm.
it's certainly among district leaders and school leaders, it's bringing about uncertainty, right, for what the future might hold. Congress is still working on its budget for next year. This is the first budget cycle that this presidency has gone through, this administration has gone through. So I think we're really going to see in the next month or so in Congress, again, what the sort of downstream effects that will be in our districts and schools.
And you began your career as a teacher. I was a fifth grade and eighth grade U.S. history and government teacher. Uh, and so we know that this is the time of year where teachers need the most resources. The understanding that their principal, the system has their back. Teaching is an all-in profession. Education is an all-in sector, and so it all working together in a coordinated way is so critical to put children at the center and develop good quality teaching and learning. Talk a little bit about the Lakota Sioux Reservation that you started teaching at.
Yes. So, I taught on the Rosebud Lakota Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, just right on the state line between South Dakota and Nebraska. And I taught in a country school where it was two classrooms. One classroom had grades K through 3, and I taught 4 through 8th grade. And then I taught at a school in town. And by in town, I mean, 823 people, when everyone was at home, type of thing. But what was
Wonderful.
interesting about, working in that context, I worked for a public school system, there, but it was the public school system was the same as the reservation there, and their education is provided through treaties, right, between those tribes and the US federal government. In most cases, it's not the federal government that has guaranteed the right to K-12 education. That right is written into state constitutions for the most part.
Mhm.
So it was through my work in that district that I even became aware of the role that the federal government played. And at the time when I was teaching, No Child Left Behind had just been passed. This was the George W. Bush administration.
Mhm.
And really, this sort of first round of sort of national accountability, my school was actually one of the first round of schools to be identified for school improvement, right? And so I, very early in my career, just by coincidence, happened to, I think, really make the connection between what was going on in my classroom and what was going on a national level, right? And very aware of the resources that were made available
Mm.
to us because of those resources at the federal level. Um, the county I lived in had the third highest child poverty of in the country. And that's the other thing, is that when the more that you're working with vulnerable populations, the higher the likelihood is that there is federal support that is helping disproportionate levels of federal support to make those systems run and run well. So, you know,
Yeah.
we can talk about, I often hesitate to say that federal education funding is only 10% of funding overall, because where it matters a lot, these changes and this impact.
And that's exactly where I want to go next. Many Americans take advantage of federal programs in schools, like school meal programs, Head Start preschool. In fact, my first graduation in life was from Jane Austen Hull House Head Start program for low income children in the heart of Chicago. And then I was at Chicago Public Schools, and our family was eligible for free and reduced lunch. Um, so, in every way, these government supports played an outsized role in my life. They didn't play a 10% role, they played a much larger role in ensuring our family was able to have a good start to life and that I was able to have a good start to school. So, what does potentially, the rumors and the language of the Department of Education cutting uh, uh, back on education, cutting back on these supports mean for us? Does it impact school meals? Does it impact Head Start? Or are these simply right now, statements that are being shared from the bully pulpit, the messaging from the president, but nothing will change? Like, what's going to really happen and what won't be touched?
Yeah, so I think we are going to start seeing those effects. So let me give an example. People would have heard of the One Big Beautiful Bill, OB3 is what I call it offhand, which made sort of sweeping changes to different programs. One of them was Medicaid, which is health insurance for that often provides health insurance and health services for low income, families and such. Um, that program, so even though that's not a program that is run by the US Department of Ed, that touches many things. One, people may not realize the fourth largest federal funding source for schools is Medicaid. That is providing services, for example, to children with disabilities and providing OT, PT, different services that they may need, or mental health supports for students in schools. Another way that Medicaid can impact schools is that Medicaid and qualifying for Medicaid is how the federal government identifies people who are in poverty. And that poverty percentage then determines whether or not a school qualifies for providing free and reduced meals, right? And so if fewer people are on Medicaid, right, it's going to look like that the poverty count went down when that isn't actually the case, right? And if the poverty count goes down, that means that there may be fewer schools that qualify to provide free meals and to their students across the board. And so again, these are sort of the trickle down effects of the policy. So we haven't seen the implementation of that bill yet, right? But we know that that will have cascading effects. I would say from a policy perspective in what I do, this is a time in which states and school districts need to be really planning for what these downstream effects might be. So they haven't hit them yet, but they're coming. And I would say, unfortunately, this is happening amid um, many other challenges that our school districts are facing. Enrollment, declined pretty dramatically, starting with COVID. And we're seeing that trend, continue. So I would say that it, I think what makes this challenging is not just that, oh, this thing is happening at the federal level. It's that this thing at the federal level is happening, and so are many other challenges at
Mhm.
the time, and it's not helping certainly our schools or our school leaders as well. So yes, I think for people like me, these things are very real. We're going to start to see them show up in our districts and classrooms in many different ways, right? As these changes impact these various systems.
Yeah. And I appreciate that our conversation began and so far has been focused on funding, programs, right? The data of who's utilizing these programs and how do we support public schools. But another or an equally big part of schooling is the values a parent brings with their child to the school and what they want the school to espouse. And what we're seeing is a trend towards privatization, both of schools and where parents want to send their kids. Um, of 100 students, around 80 to 85 students will be in public schools. About 15% are in some type of private schools, homeschools, or non traditional schools, but that number is growing. Kids are being homeschooled. More families are choosing religious schools or private schools that may have a value system more aligned to theirs if they don't feel the public schools right for them. So, is public education sacrificed if monies are going to other schools? How does this change the look and face of public schools and the students that go there. Wanted to get your thoughts on this, how faith, values, and parental choice is impacting schooling.
Yeah, and that's certainly a theme of this administration. They've definitely emphasized not just choice, but very specifically calling out parental choice uh, and emphasizing that in some of they call them dear colleague letters that they have put out into the field. For the most part, when it comes to in funding to support, you know, other school programs, right, or education, there that really has been at mostly the state level. For the first time this year, though, what we saw in that one big beautiful bill that was passed is a federal tax credit that actually states will need to be. This will be up to states to decide whether they participate in providing parents a basically tax credit for certain educational expenses. We've seen a trend of states, specifically red states, move to education savings accounts, right? ESEAs, where they are taking their portion, right, of funding. So, so it's been again interesting to see that at the federal level, particularly because that has the potential to exceed what the federal government currently provides our public schools, right, through the programs that I mentioned earlier for the different sort of targeted programs and grants that they provide. So, again, this is one of those things where I would say we see that the policy is there, right, and that they are opening up these options and opportunities. We'll see in the next year what states and local communities make of that, right? And what
Yeah.
their advocacy will be around whether or not those states participate in those programs and opt in. I would continue to say, certainly the federal government can try to influence the field, but the power of decision making still rests primarily with states and local districts. At the
Mhm.
federal level, they've talked about sending education back to the states. Education has always really been with the states. And so, what I would encourage people to do, I do think we need people to be informed about what is happening at the federal level, but they also need to be in touch with who are the decision makers at the state, right? How does their state Department of Education run? And who are their decision makers at their local school districts and schools? Because that is who is really having the impact on what is happening in classrooms.
Mhm. As a civic organization, we have seen incredible energy on school board races, more than I can ever remember as both a student and as a teacher and an educator. And so I think people are understanding that if they're not involved in their schools, if they're not part of the decision making at their local districts, then somebody else is making this decision. And I think parents are getting very involved. I think we're finding sometimes toxic ways to get involved. I would like to see a discourse that is more respectful. But when it comes to our children and it comes to our money, these are two of the most important things to families. And I mean, I can understand the challenges we're facing now as a community. All our lives have been spent and all our careers have been spent in one way or another being part of the education system in America or working within the education system in America. Or in my role now, as I shifted, people are like, oh, you've shifted from being an educator to be a civic advocate. And I said, yes, but a civic advocate or a civic educator is really how I see myself, helping a community understand their responsibilities and their power in the systems like our education systems and our power systems in the civic world. So I really enjoyed this conversation. It leads to so many more conversations that we need to have on higher education
Ye-
and what's happening there,
Yes.
on the military and what's happening at schools, ICE at school. So this is a conversation and conversations with many different leaders that we're going to continue having in the weeks to come. But I am so glad we started with you, Catherine, because you understand the key areas of teaching and learning, putting students at the center of everything we do in this sector of education and in our nation, and the money that goes with the funding of programs. So, last thoughts on, are you bullish about our education system in America? What gives you the most hope, and what concerns you the most?
Right. So, I would say where I'm bullish, I talked about this summer that they didn't, on June 30th, they told districts that they were holding on the money for this next school year. They ended up within not even a month, they ended up restoring that money and allocating it. And I will have to say that I was surprised that that happened because we've certainly seen at the federal level, they have been able to make pretty significant cuts across agencies there. And I will have to give credit to the advocacy community. That came about
Mm,
because people got that story down to like the school level. If this federal money doesn't come, this is what this means for kids in my classroom. This is what this means for families in my community. And then they called their senators. I mean, ultimately, there were senators that were appealing to the Office of Management and Budget where this money was tied up, right? And so I just think it's such a powerful reminder and example of, what many people can make move, right?
mhm.
And come out with a result that, if people hadn't been paying attention, our schools would have been short those funds. So um, and to see
And I just tell you, and there
Go ahead.
and there was great coalition building
Yes.
around that. It wasn't like one group was talking about education and schools and what was going to happen in classrooms, and then nobody else cared, or it was the teachers and no other, sector was interested. It was coalition building around race, faith, classes, communities. It was very empowering.
Yes, and that's exactly why. Because
Yeah.
I mean, I was on a call that had a student and 2 governors and parent advocates. I mean, it was across the board, and
Hmm.
we need more of that, right? And we need to be ready and everyone advocated, activated and rallied together. And I think that is going to be the way in which, if we look back on this, where we are successful. On the things that worry me the most, you know, honestly, Ed does a lot of things that we don't see in the day to day, right? And so, this infrastructure, this network of researchers,
Mm.
these studies that we're looking at a generational impact, right, on our educational system, on education programs, what we know about reading, what we know about how to teach math, right? Those things disrupted.
Mm.
y- that doesn't come back together overnight once funding gets restored, right? That's an infrastructure that takes it's easy to dismantle pretty quickly. It is very hard to build back up to robust levels.
Mm.
And so that loss, I think, is just hard and will take us again more than a generation to restore, which is why I think what we can do on the front end to preserve as much of that as possible is going to be really critical. Because if we lose that sort of institutional knowledge in the way that you started off talking about, Illinois knew that it was 50th, right? When I was in Louisiana, we knew we were 50th in reading, right? And that was a real galvanizer
Mm.
to get people to do things differently, right? And if we lose that power, if we lose the power of information that fuels the advocacy movement, I think we're going to be worse off for it. So, you know, the federal government may be relinquishing its responsibilities there for now. And I think that we need to be thinking about in organizations across the country how we're carrying the mantle on that until that can
Absolutely.
be restored again.
Absolutely. Infrastructure. finances, um, talent, and ensuring great people come into our sector, and always with the child at the center. And I think there's no substitutes for any of those working together. The children aren't our future; they are our present. They are our now. And actually, so many times the brightest spots of our times are what children are doing and what young adults are doing to set great examples for us. So, working towards and praying for the best possible school year, understanding that there's challenges, but I am so excited that we got a chance to talk. And thank you, Dr. Catherine Pozniak, for joining us.
Well, thank
Any
you.
last words?
No, well, I just wanted to, reciprocate that gratitude. Thank you for doing this and also bringing people together around these, conversations. I know that this stuff that I talk about and do every day isn't most people's every day, but I do think it's helpful for us to be aware and again, just increase our own
Mhm.
knowledge of how these systems come together and work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you to our producers of the Civic Pulse podcast. And we will continue this in a series of conversations with diverse educators working on different aspects of teaching and learning across America.